Developments in artificial intelligence can support the hiring process for all employers, including the country's largest, the federal government. But those technologies could perpetuate bias in who gets hired for which jobs. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has a new initiative to ensure those tools comply with civil rights laws. Charlotte Burrows is chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Chairwoman Burrows, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate your interest in our work.
So explain how artificial intelligence is used in the hiring process, and then give me an example of how it can be used to introduce or perpetuate bias.
Absolutely. Well, the hiring process really, with respect to artificial intelligence, is something where we've seen these tools used in a host of ways. Most significantly, frankly, in hiring, screening those first applicants and how we determine, or employers determine, who's going to be selected. So that's one area, but there's also targeted job ads and other examples in different parts of the process where they are actually being used. So let me first say what I mean by artificial intelligence, just to kind of level set for everyone. We're really looking at tools that are those broad, sort of smart technologies that try to predict who will be a good candidate on the job. And looking at those, we are, of course, the organization, the federal agency that has for so long protected employees against discrimination on the job. So as these new emerging technologies come online and begin to be used, it's important that we also assist in making sure that they don't somehow become a high-tech pathway to discrimination.
So this isn't the first time the EEOC has been looking at the issue of AI and big data. What's prompted another look at it now? What's new this time?
Well, you're exactly right. Back in 2016, we looked at this and held a broad public hearing to take some information about how these tools are being used. What has changed is that right now we've got 83% of all employers in the U.S. using some form of artificial intelligence in their hiring processes. And within actually the Fortune 500, that's about 90% according to one report. So we really can see that even in those few years, it's exploded in terms of the ubiquity, if you will, just everyone is looking at this.
But do we know that it's introducing bias, or do we just fear that it could introduce bias?
That's an excellent question. Unfortunately, we have seen very clear examples of this, and there's one that's been very widely reported. I won't name check anyone, but you can all check it out on the internet, where there was an attempt by a tech company to create one of these AI technologies to actually select its own workforce. And what they were doing was just to take their last resumes of their best folks over the last decade, let's say, and they trained the tool using those folks. Well, it turned out that most of them were white men. And they found that no matter what they did, there continued to be bias introduced where women were downgraded. And very specifically, if you had the word women's in your resume, so say you wrote, I was the captain of the women's basketball team, right? Or there were actually a couple of names of women's colleges, you were automatically downgraded because the existing population didn't have those things on their resumes. And so what it was really selecting for was a mirror of the demographics that they had. Now, obviously that doesn't have to happen, but it can. And there have been other examples as well.
So what has the EEOC done to educate employers on these issues?
So that's the purpose of the initiative, really, to make sure that folks know we can support them and help them if they want to use these techniques well, but also that the civil rights laws that we have had on the books for decades, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Equal Pay Act still apply, and how they apply and how to comply. Because I think there are a lot of employers and vendors who really want to do the right thing in this area, and they need some support. And so we are really pushing with this initiative to get them that support and also make sure the public is aware of the importance of these things as well.
Well, I do want to ask you, because your site says that you provide technical assistance for algorithmic fairness. How technical are we talking about the assistance? Because I know you're not back there writing code.
We are not back there writing code. And really what our technical assistance is, what should you look for as you design these products in terms of being fair to the employee population that you're looking at? So for example, there have been numerous concerns about, for instance, needing accommodations for persons with disabilities as they take what are referred to as gamified assessments. So if you can imagine an employment test that presents a little bit, it's online, presents a little bit almost like a video game. There's various versions of those. Well, sometimes if you have a disability, you're going to use that technology slightly differently. Or you may just need additional time or some other kind of reasonable accommodation as you take it. And so what our technical assistance is not about how to write the code, but how to make sure that as you use the product, that you're looking for those things that will make sure you do not discriminate. And of course, going back to my earlier example, making people really sensitive to the fact that you've got to look at what assumptions are being embedded in that code before you start applying it.
Well, speaking of assumptions, because there's a role for vendors here as well. So what guidance do you provide them?
So we're just at the beginning of working to, through listening sessions and discussions with experts to figure out exactly what they most need. So we haven't put that guidance out yet. I'm hoping, and this is one of the things that came out of the 2016 hearing, is that we really need to be out there with some best practices to assist in this. And that is exactly what I think where our sweet spot is, where we can be helpful as the federal government.
You talked about what you want employers to know, what you want vendors to know. What do you want the general public to know about this initiative?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's really important for people to understand first and foremost that there are a lot of these products going, behind the curtain, if you will, when you apply for a job. And if you are someone who thinks that you have a disability, you see one of these gamified assessments or something of the like, you should and can ask for a disability, and it's a requirement, or disability accommodation rather. And it's a requirement, if it's a reasonable accommodation, that you be provided that extra time or whatever it is. But the reality is, a lot of times there's no way for individuals to know about that. And so they should, if they think that they've gotten a sort of an online application that asks, for instance, insists that you give your birth date, let's say, and you can't get past to the next screen without putting that in, or the date of graduation from college, which can be a proxy for age, and they're concerned about that may lead to them being screened out, they can obviously call us, and the EEOC is the place, if you think that there may be discrimination, to reach out. We're online, we're on the phone, send us however you want to get to us. But we want to hear about these things, because only as we see them in the aggregate, then we're able to really figure out where the problems are. And the same goes if you receive an ad that may seem to you strange. So for instance, there was a widely reported example of ads going out that really sort of seemed to focus on, I'm not quoting here, but something like, hey, you're getting this ad because you're a young professional in XYZ area, right? Obviously, that has implications for the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which we also enforce. And it's important for folks who might get that to feel free to reach out to us as well.
Well, so following up on reaching out to you, I'd like to get an idea of what the process is. What if somebody just in general feels that they've been discriminated against in the workplace, or how do we go through that entire process with the EEOC?
Sure, that's an excellent question. So first of all, with respect to our laws, we enforce those laws that prohibit discrimination in employment or in applications based on race, national origin, sex, religion, color, which is becoming more and more of an issue actually, age, disability, and genetic information. So, and within sex, I should be clear, that includes pregnancy discrimination. It includes discrimination based on sexual orientation and also gender identity. So with respect to reaching us, we are actually responsible for taking charges of discrimination. So people, which is really just a complaint, and you reach out to us first and foremost online, which during this COVID period is mostly how we're hearing from folks, and start the process to file a charge, which means that we will investigate And often we can get relief right there in the investigation process, but we go all the way to a finding, which means if we decide that there's reason to believe discrimination occurred, we'll reach the employer if we haven't settled it already and say, look, you got to resolve this. If that doesn't work, we can take a case all the way to litigation, and we have instances where we've taken cases right up to the Supreme Court. The Justice Department represents us there, but we will stick with it, even if it's an individual case sometimes. If it's important, we can do that and get that relief.
Now, that's on the private industry side. What about for federal employees?
For federal employees, there's a parallel process that actually gives an internal complaint process. You could go to your EEO office. Every federal agency has to have one, and consult with them and then file what's called a complaint in that process. And then that goes through an investigation as well. And it can be appealed up to the full commission. There's 5 of us appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And so we, ultimately can make that decision as well. But if you don't like it, there's also a process by which you can file a suit in federal district court. But most of the time, I think that's we're able to resolve it internally.
So I want to ask you about retaliation, because
Yes.
that's a big issue. Somebody says, look, I've got a grievance, or I've been treated unfairly, I've been discriminated against, and all of a sudden their employer starts treating them differently.
Right, and that is ultimately a huge issue for us, not only because that's 60%, almost 56% to be exact, of all the private sector complaints we get have some form of retaliation. So it's a huge part of our inventory, and it's also a really big problem in the federal workforce as well. So we take it incredibly seriously, and all of our laws, you also can file a charge regarding the retaliation, even if the underlying we don't find that there was an underlying problem of, say, sex discrimination. We might find that the retaliation, that was real, and that is just as serious a problem. We will take those cases to court as well, if we need to. And in the federal government, you can appeal those and get relief. So what we have done actually recently, because it's such a big deal, is to join with the Department of Labor, specifically the Wage and Hour Division and the National Labor Relations Board, because they've got huge dockets on this. This is a really big problem. To have an initiative to educate employers, we rolled that out in November and sat down with a large group of employers, virtually, of course, given the conditions, just to talk about the issues that we're seeing and to make sure that they understand that this is going to be a top priority for all 3 agencies. But you're absolutely right. This is something that we have to continue to focus on.
Charlotte, I want to ask you about, the pandemic. Obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I would imagine that office dynamics have completely changed. A lot of people are working from home, and you really don't have the harassment that you might have had before when everybody's in the office together.
Oh, I wish that were true. Harassment is, a huge part of our docket as well, and unfortunately, online harassment is a very serious problem. And so we have seen that the harassment charges have not dropped off at all. During this period, it's gone online. So there's 2 things that are going on, just to give you context. First, remember, we've got about 23% of the American workforce that has gone to mostly remote work or entirely remote work. But the rest of the American workforce is there. And sometimes in those instances, there may be fewer supervisors or less close supervision than there was before. So on the one hand, you have online harassment, which is increasingly a problem. And it's interesting because there are things as varied as supervisors who might be calling the attractive younger worker more often unnecessarily to get that video conference. And they're also learning a lot about what's going on in that person's home, right? A lot of very personal information that you normally wouldn't get. We've heard instances of individuals who have perhaps a very offensive, something in the background in their home workplace that an employee who's calling them is uncomfortable with. Or
you're taking Zoom in your bedroom because that happens to be where you're working, yeah.
Exactly. So you would think that wouldn't be an issue online, but it actually is a quite significant problem. And so we're seeing it in both areas, unfortunately, and are very vigilant about that.
There's a White House executive order on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Yes. It's a big push by the administration. What's your office doing to advance those goals?
Absolutely. So thank you for the question. We are very excited about this because if you think about it, the opposite of a employment situation where we have to get involved is an employer where you have really valued diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So with respect to there were two really exciting executive orders issued very early on in this administration, day one on the first one, that really try to make sure that we have an all-of-government approach to this problem. And with respect to the federal government's own workforce, we are thrilled to be assisting in that. We give technical assistance to the entire executive branch, actually, on these issues. We have a whole sort of division within the EEOC that really only focuses on the federal sector. And we are assisting in that way as well. But the idea is to really make sure that America fields the best team, that we have the best talent here. And you can do that by making sure that everyone has the opportunity to apply, to advance. So we're really looking in detail at those issues.
You mentioned that the EEOC has 5 commissioners appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. How do you all work together in the sense of how do you coordinate with other federal agencies to get the work done that you need to do?
So it really depends on the issues. But yes, there are 5 of us. It's exciting to have a full commission. And we, depending on what we're doing on the policy issues, we come together. Sometimes we come together in a public way, like the hearing I was talking about earlier, or internally. And we have to do that carefully because under the Sunshine Act, we can't all gather in a room without announcing it to the public, but and work cooperatively with the other agencies, but really sort of think about the policy internally. And most of that, our office sort of runs point with the rest of the administration so that we stay coordinated. And so for some of these things, we are really looking at all of the other federal leaders that have equities in this and working cooperatively.
You've been there since 2014. What trends have you seen in employment discrimination since you've been there?
Oh, absolutely. So I actually started January 2015. I was confirmed in 2014. And so I've had the pleasure of looking at this with from a bird's eye view and also from a broad spectrum. And really the trends have been, and I think this is really exciting right now, that we've seen in our work that the EEOC is sort of in the front of the curve of when there's a big problem coming in these areas. So for instance, we knew that the Me Too issues were a 5-alarm fire. And in fact, I think my first week of work, we voted to create a bipartisan commission or task force rather, to look only at the question of how to get in front of harassment. And that process took 18 months. Well, during the course of it, Me Too got on everybody else's top radar screen, but we were already working on that in 2015, 2016, came out with a report. So by the time 2017, there were some reports about Harvey Weinstein that people may remember. We were really ahead of the curve. And so that's been great. Right now, what I think is extremely exciting, going back to the point about diversity, is that after the really terrible news about the murder of George Floyd, the nation has really wrestled with those issues of broader inequality and fairness to persons of color. And a lot of corporations came out with, sort of mission statements and value statements about how they were going to deal with diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and are following up on those. And so to the extent that we already had diversity on the front burner, and the administration did, what's exciting now, and a really important trend, is that corporations do too. Other organizations do too. So interestingly enough, we really have that synergy now, and I think it's going to be exciting. You're going to be hearing a lot more about us. No big announcements right now, but a lot more from us about this issue in the coming weeks and months.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about, but we're out of time. Chairwoman Burrows, thank you so much for being on the program and coming in.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.